Welcome in this video of the House of Asian Cinema. With only 4 films, Bruce Lee has become a world phenomenon. A cinematic icon, but also a symbol of minority struggle worldwide, a rallying point for Chinese nationalism, and a martial art evangelist. With so many facets, the Little Dragon myth tends to erase the reality behind the man. Consequently, it's no surprise when cinema tried to feature Bruce Lee after his death. They usually did so using this distorted picture of the myth. In this video, we will see which film based on the life of the star is the closest to the reality. Let's clarify from the start that the goal is to study films in which Bruce Lee, the man and actor, feature and not the fictional characters he played in films. Thus, most of the Bruceploitation films in which the clones played Shenzhen from Fist of Fury or Chang from The Big Boss are excluded. It also excludes films in which they act as a copy of the star, such as in The Game of Death or Goodbye Bruce Lee. Chanhua's and William Chung's story of the dragon was close to qualify for this contest, as it does borrow from real events from Bruce Lee's life in the USA, but the story is way too fictional to deserve consideration. Now let's meet the challengers. Super Dragon, also known as Dragon Dies Hard, also known as Bruce Lee: A Dragon Story. Directed in 1974 by Shi-Ti, this Taiwanese production, sometimes credited as the very first Bruceploitation film, features Bruce Lee and tells the story of the Little Dragon from his stay in the USA until his death, with an emphasis on his relationship with Betty Ting-pei and his glory time in Hong Kong. Bruce Lee: True Story. Directed by Si-yoon in 1976, Bruce Lee: True Story sees once again Bruce Lee acting as the star and deals roughly with the same time frame as the previous film. Chinese Sichuan Kung Fu, also known as The Legend of Bruce Lee, also known as Bruce Lee Superstar or Young Bruce Lee. This 1976 Taiwanese production, handled by Lin Bing, has the inescapable Bruce Lee covering the entirety of the life of the Little Dragon, from his learning of martial arts in Hong Kong to his death in 1973. Is a Legend, Is a Hero. 1976 was the fake Bruce Lee year, as Is a Legend, Is a Hero is the third production of this type made that year. Once again produced in Taiwan and directed by Wong Xing-lei, it uses once again Bruce Lee to deal with the whole life of the Little Dragon. Bruce Lee and I. Produced by the Shaw Brothers in 1976 and directed by John Loma, the film is more a fantasized biography of actress Betty Ting-pei than a Bruce Lee biopic. The second half of the film deals with her love story with Bruce Lee, for once not played by Bruce Lee but by Danny Lee. Dragon: A Bruce Lee Story. Produced by Hollywood in 1993, Dragon is without a doubt the most famous biopic of Bruce Lee. Directed by Rob Cohen, the film was approved by Linda Lee, and while following the main events of Bruce Lee's life, this time played by Jason Scott Lee, is especially concerned by the love story between the star and his wife. Bruce Lee: My Brother. Made by Raymond Yip and Manfred Wong in 2010, Bruce Lee: My Brother is based on the memories of his brother Robert Lee. Unlike most of the titles previously listed, the film avoids dealing with Bruce Lee's life in the States or his transformation into a kung fu star later, but focuses instead on his youth in the British colony. He is played by Arif Lee. Birth of the Dragon. A 2016 American independent production, Birth of the Dragon was made by George Nolfi and only deals with the famous duel between Bruce Lee, played by martial artist Philip and Wong Jackman. Ip Man 4. Directed by Wilson Yip, the last entry in the Wing Chun's Master Saga features his most famous disciple, played by Danny Chan. To award a winner, we will judge the following criteria: the physical likeness between the actor chosen and the real Bruce Lee, the reality of his childhood in Hong Kong, the reality of his stay in the USA, the reality of his return to Hong Kong and his triumph as a kung fu star, the reality of his death, the reality of his love life, the reality of his martial arts style. The notation system will be simple. -1 when the film mostly invents things, 0 when it avoids the subject or has as much invented elements than real ones, +1 when it respects reality. May the best win. The physical likeness. If Bruce Lee was the most popular clone of Bruce Lee, it was for a good reason. He is indeed one of the truest to life. So it made sense most of the biopics made in the 70s hired him. Thanks to his casting, Super Dragon, Bruce Lee True Story, The Legend of Bruce Lee, and Is a Legend is a Hero have a +1. Bruce Lee and I used a regular from the Shaw Brothers studio back then, a young Danny Lee. If he manages to be convincing in wide shots, the illusion is broken as soon as there are close-ups. -1 for John Law's film. Similarly, Jason Scott Lee and Rob Cohen's Dragon do not look like the Little Dragon. Still, he manages to emulate many attitudes of the star, making it easy to forget the obvious differences in physics. 0 for this mixed result. For Bruce Lee My Brother, the newcomer Arif Lee was chosen to give life to this youthful incarnation of Bruce Lee. A good choice. The young man plays him with plenty of conviction and does look a bit like him. He deserves a +1. Birth of the Dragon selected martial artist Philip M to act as Bruce Lee. If his martial arts credentials are flawless, his likeness with the star is fairly limited and we have to give a sad -1 to the film. Danny Chan, who acts as Bruce in Ip Man 4, is a regular in this kind of exercise, as he had already been a clone of Lee in Shaolin Soccer, and then in the costly TV series on The Little Dragon, The Legend of Bruce Lee. Even with time passing, he remains physically close to the star and has perfected his mannerism, so he gets a +1. His childhood in Hong Kong. Despite being an extremely important time period for The Little Dragon, Bruce Lee's childhood has rarely been dealt with in the different biopics made on him. There is no trace of it in Super Dragon, Bruce Lee and I, Birth of the Dragon, and Ip Man 4. 0 for all these films. Bruce Lee True Story only has a short sequence in which Bruce practices his Wing Chun under the watchful eye of Ip Man, played by his son Ip Chun, the latter asking his student to spread the spirit of Kung Fu all over the world. Not much to get from that, and so it has a 0. The Legend of Bruce Lee is the first film to dive deeper in this time period, but the result is a complete fantasy. Most of it deals with his apprenticeship in martial arts. A very young Bruce Lee starts learning Kung Fu from an unmotivated master and loses as soon as he gets into a fight. He meets another master, most likely supposed to be Ip Man, but who is closer to an old master from Kung Fu films of the period, who accepts to teach him martial arts. Once an adult, he gets many opportunities to show off his Kung Fu skills. The young man also has a romantic relationship with a childhood friend. It could be a reference to Margaret Lung, Amy Chan or Pearl Cho, the first loves of Bruce Lee, but there is no way to clearly identify her, and it seems to be rather a convenient way to have a major female Chinese actress rather than out of respect for his real childhood. A male friend is also present, potentially based on Unicorn Chan, but the character is mostly made up of all the clichés from the Kung Fu films of the time. A big -1 for The Legend of Bruce Lee. The other biography of 1976 is The Legend is a Hero, touches on the star childhood too, but in less than 5 minutes. We see his parents, his birth, and his martial art training. If he is way too young when he starts his Wing Chun practice, the general configuration is nevertheless closer from reality than The Legend of Bruce Lee. +1 for this fairly good result. Bruce Lee's childhood is barely touched in Dragon. We see his father, Leo Chun, correctly identified as a former opera star, the start of his Wing Chun training under Ip Man, and a glimpse of his love for Cha-Cha. But the devil is in the details, and if checking carefully, inaccuracies are everywhere. Despite what is stated in the film, Bruce didn't start Wing Chun in 1949, but in 1955, and his studies were under the lead disciple of Ip Man, Wang Chunlong, and not the old master himself. He never had a fight with American sailors, and didn't leave Hong Kong because of that, so Dragon gets a result of 0. Bruce Lee, My Brother is the only film which covers Bruce Lee's childhood in depth. Thanks to the involvement of his brother Robert Lee, the film is very respectful of the reality of his childhood, may it be the environment in which he grew up or the relationships in his family. The period of reconstitution is also of the highest quality. If there are a few liberties taken from time to time, it is still the only film showing some interesting aspects of his childhood, from his tense relationship with his father to his career as a child actor, or his love of cha-cha. Logically, the film can be proud of its +1 for this realistic depiction of the young days of the actor. His stay in the US. While Bruce Lee's childhood has often been glossed over, his time in the USA has been one of the favorite topics of his cinematic biography. Only Bruce Lee and I on Bruce Lee, My Brother avoids it and gets a 0. Super Dragon was the trendsetter, setting the tones for most of the biopics to follow, to anchor the story around a few real events while taking many liberties when describing them in details. For example, while Bruce Lee is indeed shown as taking part in the Long Beach tournament, he is wrongly depicted as having a real fight. His martial arts school is shown as much more traditional than it was, and the young man is always facing the opposition of Japanese martial artists. This later idea most likely borrowed from the many nationalistic martial art films to which Lee had greatly contributed with his Fist of Fury. But by doing so, there is not much reality left in this depiction of Bruce Lee's stay in the US in Super Dragon, and it gets a sad -1. A third of Bruce Lee's story takes place in the States. We follow the young man at Washington University in Seattle, then after his studies in San Francisco where he teaches martial arts. We see him taking part in the Long Beach tournament, work in Hollywood, and face the discrimination from the studio executives. The film clearly benefits from having been partially shot in the real locations and to follow the rough history of Bruce Lee. Still, the devil is in the details and the scriptwriters have taken many liberties. While his martial arts journey is slightly simplified, the need to deliver as many fight scenes as possible led to the creation of an artificial rivalry with the karate dojo and claim he participated in a real fight during the Long Beach tournament. Two complete inventions. This mixed approach gets a 0 to the film. The legend of Bruce Lee starts well with the little dragon going to the US at the request of his parents. He is shown teaching martial arts and taking part in the Long Beach tournament. Of course, invented fights are added in order to deliver as many action scenes as possible. An uneven result and a 0 for the legend of Bruce Lee. Is a Legend is a Hero shows Bruce Lee directly in San Francisco and completely gloss over his studies in Seattle. He finds himself in a series of small comical incidents in a way which remind the viewer of The Way of the Dragon. The Long Beach tournament is once again emphasized. It is actually the film in which it is the most developed, but still with the idea that Bruce won a real fight, here against a clone of Muhammad Ali. His martial art teaching is barely touched upon, and the only noteworthy episode of his life in the US shown in the film is his participation to the Green Hornet, in which Bruce complains about the appearance of his character, considered an insult to Chinese. Nothing works here and the film gets a -1. Bruce's American stay occupies most of Dragon's screen time. The film benefits from showing some real events of his life rarely touched upon in the other biopics, such as when he had to work in a restaurant when he was in Seattle, when he had to struggle to run his martial arts school, or when he hurt his back. Surprisingly enough, it is also the first film to show his fight against Wong Jack-man. If this is commendable, the film falls in the same pitfalls than 1970s Bruceploitation flicks by adding fights as soon as an opportunity arises. May it be with jealous cooks or the scriptwriter's favorite event, the famous Long Beach tournament. Moreover, the chronology is a complete mess. Rob Cohen's film can only get a 0. Birth of the Dragon mostly deals about the San Francisco time of its American period. The limited time frame allows the film to concentrate on Bruce Lee, the martial art teacher, and it does a pretty good job on that level. with a Bruce Lee close with his students but also arrogant and with a sense of humor. This accurate description is unfortunately countered by the usual Bruceploitation habits. The addition of fights at any occasion possible, such as the Long Beach tournament. If we add up that we see Bruce Lee already shooting films and the complete fantasy that is his fight with Wong Jackman, the film cannot pretend to anything higher than a 0. Ip Man 4 follows fairly faithfully the Long Beach tournament but takes some liberty by including Ip Man, while the Old Master never visited the US, and by having the Little Dragon fighting a band of American karate practitioners just after. Another mixed result and another 0 for Wilson Yip's film. The return to Hong Kong. Bruce Lee being mostly known for the kung fu films he did once he came back to Hong Kong in 1971, this short period of his life is obviously of the greatest importance. Bruce Lee My Brother, Birth of the Dragon and Ip Man 4 do not deal with the subject, so they get a 0. Super Dragon starts poorly as Bruce justifies his trip back to Hong Kong to his wife as completely natural, as China is my country. Let's put aside that back then Hong Kong was a British colony, and let's remind everyone that Bruce, even if he did not exclude the possibility to come to Hong Kong to work, had no plans to come back, and it was the warm welcome he received when he came to see his family in 1970, the failure of his many projects in Hollywood between 1970 and 1971, and Raymond Shaw's offer which convinced him to go back home. Things improve once there as we see Bruce refusing the offer from Shaw Brothers to choose the Golden Harvest one, shoot some emblematic sequences like the final of The Big Boss, and confront a clone of Lo Wei. Too bad the film adds a side plot with a dubious producer whose only reason to be here is to provide a few fights. A mixed approach and a 0 for Super Dragon. In Bruce Lee True Story, MCU follows his usual formula when it comes to the glory time of Bruce Lee once in Hong Kong, respecting the rough storyline of his rise to fame while adding many fight scenes. Thus, the Little Dragon has to constantly answer duels, may it be on The Big Boss, Fist of Fury, Enter the Dragon, or even in the street. If there is a bit of truth in that, it is widely exaggerated. Still, the film benefits from having been shot in the real locations and with real friends from Bruce, such as Unicorn Chan. Once again, a 0 for this mixed result. Under the bad influence of this imaginary childhood friend, the legend of Bruce Lee connects the return of the star in Hong Kong to him and go full fiction, with Lee almost a supporting part for this invented character. When that's not the case, the Little Dragon has to face jealous martial artists. The few accurate scenes, such as when he participates in the TV show Enjoy Yourself Tonight, are buried under this tsunami of fallacies, and the film gets a well-deserved -1. The Chinese pride is at the heart of his A Legend is a Hero and the motivation for Bruce Lee's return to Hong Kong. If this is a complete invention, the rest adopts the good old formula of recreating some famous sequences, such as the dojo fight from Fist of Fury, adding fights with jealous martial artists, and making up events, some fairly funny, like when Bruce meets a clone of Chang-Chi. Let's be generous and give a 0 to the film. Bruce Lee on I shows a Bruce Lee already at the top of his star power. He is described as very confident, almost arrogant. Not untrue, but still a bit simplistic. We see the actor shooting films which look like Big Boss and Fist of Fury, but Betty met the star only after the making of his films. His relationship with Lo Wei is rightfully shown as difficult, with his wife playing the middleman. When production of Enter the Dragon is being discussed, the Little Dragon insists for Betty to be the star. If it is indeed true he wanted to give the main female part to his mistress, in reality he changed his mind and it ended up to Betty Chung. In Bruce Lee on I, it's the death of the star which prevents this casting to happen, which makes no sense at all, as Bruce Lee did shoot Enter the Dragon before his death. This mix of fantasy and reality leads to a 0 for the film. In Dragon, Bruce comes back to Hong Kong following the disappointment of David Carradine's casting for the Kung Fu TV series and the death of his father, Lee Hoi-chun. Given that the latter is dead in 1965, that the TV series was shown in 1972, and that the Little Dragon came back to Hong Kong in 1971, it's pretty clear the chronology is a complete mess. Once there, Bruce is hired by a clone of Raymond Cho, fight a rival during the shooting of The Big Boss, becomes a star following the release of Lo Wei's film, and argues strongly for Enter the Dragon to be made, leading to a fantasized recreation of the final mirror scene. Real events are deeply interconnected with the invented ones, and the film ends up with a 0. And shame on the artistic director for not even having tried to hide the name of the Machinist Theatre in which the premiere of Big Boss in Hong Kong supposedly happened. His death. Still today, the reasons behind Bruce Lee's death are the subject of multiple theories, more or less credible. If the official explanation which was given following the inquest is indeed arguable, events surrounding his death are now fairly known and can be assessed objectively. Bruce Lee, My Brother, Birth of the Dragon and Ip Man 4 do not push into this territory and get a 0. Super Dragon, shot only 1 year after the death of the star, correctly set Bruce Lee's death in his mistress' apartment. If the film is pretty vague on why he was there and what he was doing, the general circumstances of his death are roughly correct. So Super Dragon deserves a +1. Bruce Lee True Story also has Bruce at Betty Ting's Space Place before his death. More precise than Super Dragon on why he was there, we see him discussing the script of the Game of Death with the actress. Si-yoon's film also benefits from a good description of what happened after his death was discovered, with Raymond Cho who came to Ting's place. All these positives are sadly cancelled when the film decides to end up by giving life to the craziest theories about his death. An unfortunate 0 because of his very disappointing way to conclude the film. Legend of Bruce Lee avoids delving into the subject by showing Bruce Lee's death as a newspaper announcement. A careful stance which leads to a 0 for the film. For Is a Legend, Is a Hero, the filmmakers follow the template of Super Dragon with Bruce Lee at Betty Ting's place. The film goes one step higher by showing the two actors making love. His death is evocated through a weird psychotronic sequence during which the little dragon hallucinates. This artistic license put aside, the film implies he passed away prematurely because of his intense training regimen. Consequently, Is a Legend, Is a Hero can proudly show off a +1 for its relative realism on the subject. No problem to have Bruce Lee at Betty Ting's apartment for Bruce Lee and I, as the film is centered on her. If the scene showing them before the unfortunate event is obviously erotic exploitation and there is no discussion about the Game of Death, it is still close enough from reality to benefit from a +1. In Dragon, the star's death is barely touched upon through a short monologue from his wife. A fairly cautious choice. But Dragon makes the weird decision to connect the death of the little dragon to a millennial family curse, symbolized by a mysterious warrior in a samurai armor, directly borrowed from Terry Gilliam's Brazil. This choice, partly inspired by a real superstition Lee Hoi-chun believed in, but grossly exaggerated by the scriptwriter's ear, pulls the film down and leads to a -1 for Dragon. His love life. A subject as sensitive as the reasons of his death, Bruce Lee had an animated love life. If the Bruce Lee Foundation, led by his wife and later by his daughter, is prone to promote him as a faithful and loving husband, we know the first adjective was far from the truth. Birth of the Dragon and Ip Man 4 don't touch on this subject and gets a 0. If Super Dragon shows the little dragon in a relationship with the Caucasian most likely to be Linda Emery, the main romance in the film is between Bruce Lee and the simile Betty Tingpei. Linda Emery then completely disappears from the film, physically of course, but also out of the simple fact that she is married to the actor, which is never stated. This memory loss of the script and the excessive romanticization of the Betty Tingpei relationship are partly countered by the fact that the two most important women of his life are indeed present, and the film gets a 0. Si-yoon's film chooses to remain careful when it comes to Bruce Lee's personal life. We see nothing of the early stage of his relationship with Linda, nor any other of his conquest. There are only a couple of shots illustrating how he was a loving but overworked husband and father, and his relationship with Betty Ting-pei is very discreetly implied. Bruce Lee, A True Story gets once again a 0. As previously stated, the legend of Bruce Lee took heavy liberties about young Bruce Lee's love life in Hong Kong. The film makes some corrections once he is in the US with the start of a relationship with a wannabe Linda Emery, close enough from reality. But the character of Chow Mei remains in the story and there is nothing about his infidelities. Another -1 for the legend of Bruce Lee. Of all the Hong Kong and Taiwanese films, Is a Legend, Is a Hero is the one which developed the most the relationship between Bruce and Linda Emery. Even if it's not deep, they are at least shown as sincere in their feelings, Linda being really worried for her husband's health. Moreover, the relationship with Betty Ting-pei is present and rings quite true. Thanks to these efforts, the film deserves a +1. Produced by Betty Ting-pei, Bruce Lee and I was supposed to show us what kind of man the little dragon was in his intimacy. Unfortunately, the interesting intention is nowhere to be seen on the screen. What we have here is for the most part cliché and fantasy. One only needs to look at the way the two actors met. In reality, Betty met Bruce in 1972 following the success of Fist of Fury's premiere, introduced to him by Raymond Shaw, with Linda present. In the film, things are way more dramatized as Betty is rescued from some thugs by Bruce Lee. Obviously, it's hard to know what's true from what's false given their relationship was very discreet. But the film is way too one-sided to ring true. Betty being shown as an innocent victim, a perfect daughter, a misunderstood actress because of her all-powerful sex appeal. No other choice than to give a -1 to this dishonest film. Based on Linda Lee's book and endorsed by her, Dragon quite logically concentrates on the little dragon love story with his wife. His infidelities and especially his relationship with Betty Ting-pei are consciously left out. The film seems to imply Bruce had some affairs before meeting Linda, which is to its benefit, but it's still quite subdued. If the love story of Bruce and Linda in the film works, it takes many liberties with the reality. The goal is clearly to make it more romantic and glamorous than it was in real. In the film, she's the only woman in his school, while in real she was one amongst others. A pregnancy, which led to their wedding, is glossed over, even if the film has the decency to show the Emery family having reservation about Linda marrying an Asian. Dragon earns a 0 in this department. By dealing solely with Bruce Lee's youth, Bruce Lee, My Brother can show another side, more romantic and innocent, of the little dragon. As previously stated, only the legend of Bruce Lee had tried to do so, and for a very poor result. Here, his special relation with Margaret Lung is indeed present, as well as the more serious one with Pearl Chow. One can wonder why Amit Chan was left out, but it's still a minor complaint, and the film deserves a +1 for its good work. His martial arts style. Aside from his charisma, it is of course Bruce Lee's martial arts expertise which has made him a film star. This cinematic Jeet Kune Do has become his trademark, but it is the result of a long martial journey. Unfortunately, most biopics have shown it as a given from the very start of his life. Appreciate this criteria, we need to see if the film takes into consideration the differences between practical Jeet Kune Do and cinematic Jeet Kune Do, but also if they follow his martial art evolution from a street brawler to a Wing Chun practitioner to the integration of other disciplines. Super Dragon sets the tone when it comes to Bruce Lee martial arts representation by emphasizing on his foot techniques. There is no trace of Wing Chun in the fights, but some other styles from boxing to karate are added into the mix. Consequently, the film ends up with a 0. Bruce Lee True Story suffers from the same problem, with an even higher emphasis on jumping techniques and acrobatics. But the film does incorporate some Wing Chun moves, especially when it comes to counters. Si-Yun's film also ends up with a 0. The Legend of Bruce Lee also adds some Wing Chun moves in its choreographies, but spoils it by adding many kicking techniques which the young boy would not have mastered back then when he was in Hong Kong. Once again, another 0 for the film. He's a legend, he's a hero, makes the bold choice to show a struggling Bruce Lee during his first serious fight against a Muhammad Ali clone, impaired by his traditional techniques. This interesting idea is partially negated by the fact that his style hasn't much to do with Wing Chun and ends up being thrown out of the window when he finally got to win by doing multiple acrobatics out of nowhere. A good concept, utterly destroyed by a careless execution, and a -1 for the film. Bruce Lee and I has the Yun clan in charge of the action, but the result is very uneven. The recreation of his most iconic scenes suffer from comparison. And the other fights, while well made, are typical of the end of the 70s and have nothing to do with Bruce Lee's style. -1 for Bruce Lee and I. Despite having veteran John Chung in charge of the choreographies, Dragon suffers from the inability of American cinema of the time to shoot correctly martial arts fights. Even worse, in his very first fight, while he's just a teenager, he does plenty of acrobatics and kicking techniques. Why bother showing him practicing Wing Chun a few scenes earlier? Moreover, his punching style is closer to the John Wayne school of punching than the punching burst from Yim Wing Chun style. Things doesn't improve during the course of the film, quite the opposite. It's full Bruce Lee cinematic style without the Hong Kong mastery when it comes to directing and editing such scenes. -1 without hesitation. Bruce Lee, my brother, has very few fights. The first serious one is based on a real boxing match Bruce had during a school tournament against the champion of his weight category, Gary Helms. While until then the film had been very true in its description of the little dragon's childhood, the fight scene is a mess, with Bruce showing off a Muhammad Ali-like footwork. In reality, the young boy won thanks to his Wing Chun, which only appears here at the very end of the fight. The return match between the two boys, a complete fantasy, is more generous with Wing Chun techniques, but still adds moves from his cinematic mythology, which would have been unknown to the young boy in 1958. The film gets a 0 for this mixed result. Even if it is an American production, Birth of the Dragon hired Ko Rae-yoon to take care of the choreographies. The former Beijing opera student had done a good job when it came to imitate Bruce Lee's style on his No Retreat No Surrender 20 years earlier. Here we have a mix of Wing Chun, boxing and kicking techniques from karate and taekwondo. Given the time frame, while Bruce Lee was experimenting with new techniques and was starting to develop his Jeet Kune Do, it is a credible mix, well served by Philip Ng. If the direction and editing could be more dynamic, the film still gets a +1 for its good work. Ip Man 4 chooses to use the cinematic style of Bruce Lee for his fight scene with a band of karate practitioners. Thanks to the expertise of Yuen Woo-ping and his team, the result is excellent. But one can wonder if in 1967 Lee would have used such a style in a street fight. Thus, the film only gets a 0. With a score of -2 points, The Legend of Bruce Lee and I, and Dragon all earned the title of Worst Bruce Lee Biopic. Congratulations for their efforts. The real winner is Bruce Lee, My Brother by Raymond Yip and Manfred Wong with a final score of +3. The first runner-up is Is a Legend, Is a Hero with +2 points. All the others are stuck around 0 or +1 point because of their inability to choose between the reality and the myth. And it is indeed the core problem scriptwriters and filmmakers had to deal with. The mythical image promoted by his 4 kung fu films has systematically strangled the attempts to describe the life of the man. A problematic still valid today given the reaction to his appearance in Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Things have been made even more complicated by the conflicting symbolic he represents between the West and the East, and the fact both wants to appropriate his image. For the US, he is the ultimate success story. A small immigrant from a minority who managed to make it big and become a Hollywood star. A convenient way to exorcise the old demon of racism the country has been based on. In this interpretation of the myth, his childhood in Hong Kong is anecdotal. What matters is his stay in the US. His return to Hong Kong is just a parenthesis to reach the ultimate prize, to become an American star. For Hong Kong people, Bruce Lee is the prodigal son, the one who shows the superiority of Chinese culture and makes Chinese people all over the world proud. Here, it is his stay in the US which is seen as a parenthesis, and his return to Hong Kong is the desired achievement, with the cherry on the top being Hollywood executives forced to come to Hong Kong to court him. These conflicting narratives are perfectly symbolized by the duel between Bruce Lee and Wong Jackman, which took place in 1964. It's worth noting that while all biopics from Hong Kong and Taiwan didn't hesitate to invent fights for the little dragon to take part in, none of them used one of the few real fights in which the martial artist was involved. Most likely because showing two Chinese fighting against each other was against the nationalist narrative, which was most of the time emphasized in these films. On the other hand, for the American, this fight is a symbol of the struggle between modernity, the integration in the American melting pot, against an obsolete and overly rigid Chinese tradition. In reality, it was the action of a very small group of martial artists who had felt insulted by Bruce Lee's disparagement of some traditional martial arts system, and a way for the Northern-style master to get some publicity for an upcoming martial arts school. But once again, the brightness of the Little Dragon myth tends to obscure the reality.